How's it going, YouTube? Back with another video on the Bloodbath Rule version of Axis and Allies Global 1940, created by YouTube user Sired Blood, longtime Global 40 player who created his own set of house rules, just like Chris and I did with our Omega set rules, except his has evolved into quite a unique version of the game, followed by lots of people out there. So in my prior video on this rule set, we talked just about this board, this beautiful custom set version of the map itself, and we got into all the little things that make this map different from the out-of-box 1940 map that the other versions of the game are played on, including the Omega rules. In this video, we'll be talking about the rules, how to play the game, what makes playing BBR different than the regular out-of-box set. There might be a subsequent video one of these days that kind of gets more into the weeds on different versions of the game, comparing and contrasting this version versus Omega set versus out of the box. This is more just an instructional video. This is a video about what makes BBR different from Global 1940. How do you learn this version of the game, coming to it as a player of the regular game? And so we're going to base this discussion on what's called version 6.8 of the rulebook, which he calls the Rules of Warfare. And he's given us a nice little printed out version that contains all the rules of the original game with his weaved into it. That's a helpful resource. There are also this is a revision page, this is a set of optional rules we'll mention. That is one critique I'll have here at the outset of the conversation about this version of the rule set, and that's just that it has been difficult for me to wrap my head around which version of the rules I'm supposed to be playing. How do I find the most recent version? How do I confirm that the version that I have is in fact the most recent? And how do I confirm that the different accessories that I have go with the right version of the game? Because there have been a lot. We're at 6.8 here. I've seen going back to 3 and 4 and 5 floating around the internet. You'll see that the version here of the map that I have, the credits even call it version 7.0, and I've seen a Series 7 set of rules that are apparently either a 1941 or a 1942 setup. I'm not quite sure which. There is a Discord that Sired Blood runs for this rule set. There is a Facebook community that's relatively active. Even after consulting all of those sources, though, and talking to players in person, especially the player that sold me all these accessories, I had a hard time just reaching a confidence level that I was using the right version. It took talking to that player, who I think knows more and certainly been playing this version a lot longer than I have, to help me be confident that this is in fact the right rule set to be talking about. But nothing I found on the internet was really that super clear. So that's one critique I'd have. I mean, obviously this is an informal labor of love, a fan-driven version of the game. So you can't be too harsh in that judgment. I'm just observing that that's the status of things in this particular corner of fandom. So it took me a minute to wrap my head around it. Regardless, that's where we're at. I'm told by my friend that 6.8 is supposed to be the last version of the rule set, that this map is supposed to be the last version of the map. So, that may or may not end up being true. It will be until it isn't. But regardless, this is the version of the rules we're going to be talking about. So what makes this rule set different? Well, a whole lot. Sired Blood himself, pictured there, starts his rule book with a handy-dandy list of differences for players just like those that I'm talking to now who are G40 players who want to know what makes it different. And the list gets kind of lengthy, and these are, one-shot descriptions that have quite a bit of detail and nuance into them, so we're going to break that down a little bit further. I'll break it down into 4 categories, which really kind of cover everything about the game. One is, how do you win? Because that's different. The second is the political situation. Players of G40 know that the political situation is important. It describes what the different countries, different players can and can't do at different points of the game. And then there is how combat works and how the units themselves work. Each one of those buckets of rules have been tweaked in this version of the game. You saw that long list. There's even more. It's to the point where, it's not just a handful of changes like I like to think our Omega rules are that kind of tweak the original game. This is, really starting to metamorphose into its own unique playing experience. So we're going to break down each one of those categories of rules first and try to make it as digestible and learnable as possible. I have had the opportunity to play a game of this all the way through with a group of guys. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. I bought all these accessories because I want to play it again. And hopefully Chris and I will get a chance to do that this summer, film it and post a playthrough of BBR. But it's going to take a little work, so that's why this video is here, so you can walk through that journey with me. So let's begin with the first question, the first bucket of rules. How do you win this game? All right, the first bucket of rules that's important to understand for BBR is, how do you win? What's the end goal? As we know in Out of Box, it's either taking all the capitals of the other side or getting to a certain economic level, a couple approaches to that. In our Omega rule set, we break that down, represent the various ways of winning with victory tokens, and come up with 8 or so ways that each side can win victory tokens, and winning means getting a certain number of those. BBR kind of takes that approach up to a whole new level with a point system. And honestly, I gotta say, this is one of the tweaks of BBR that I am enjoying the most. It adds a lot of flexibility to how you play the game. First thing to understand about BBR is that it is a time-limited system. The default version of the game is played only up to 8 rounds. So you only go around the board. Each country only gets 8 turns. That's different in a significant way from many G40 games, as you'll see just by watching through Chris and I's videos. Now, a lot of times who's going to win by turn 4 or 5. It's pretty obvious, and sometimes the game itself is over by turn 6. That certainly happens in some of our videos. In others, like the 23 round or the 19 round monster games that we've posted, it's quite a bit different, and these games go on for days. Frankly, that's one aspect of the game that I like, right? That it is complex, and you can go into great lengths to win the game. But, that's an investment of time that not everybody's willing to make. So I think one of the primary drivers, from what I've gathered, for Sired Blood to even come up with this version in the first place is to make it a game that can be played in one day. And that is the genesis of the 8-round limitation. And because of that, it's really not a question of how do the allies win this game. It's a question of how do the Axis win. And so we have here, and this is a nice accessory that I picked up, another neoprene mat, just like the map itself. But this is a map of all of the points that the Axis player can get, all the ways an Axis player can get points throughout the game. Now you'll see in the default version of the game, you can tweak it. You can say, okay, we'll play up to 9 rounds, we'll play up to 10 rounds, whatever else, and go from there. But in a 8-round game, the Axis win if they get 12 points. Okay, how do they get 12 points? Well, that's indicated by the little red markers here, and there's handy dandy little checklist to keep track of those points. The first way to get them is by victory cities, and you'll see some familiar names on that list, each one of them being a victory city and each one of them being worth a point. Now, I've set it up here with the 4 cities that the Axis start with. So the Axis are going to begin the game with 4 out of the 12 points that they need to win right out of the bat. And of course, we all know that the very first thing that happens in a game of Axis and Allies Global 1940 is taking Paris. So, in fact, they're essentially starting with 5 points that they need. And a couple of these other cities, like Hong Kong, they're in Stalingrad, they're going to come pretty soon. So, Leningrad first. In any event, the cities get you roughly half the way there. But we all know that getting all of these is no easy task. And you'll find a few names on there that you don't recognize because they're new victory cities added to this version of game. So, for example, we've got Rio de Janeiro. We've got Juneau in Alaska. Manila is already one. Ottawa was already one. So these are a few extra victory cities to choose from. And even having those options, right, give you different reasons to care about South America or Alaska, territories that usually don't matter in the game as it is. And in addition to that, we get some larger goals, and some of these are pretty similar to the victory token conditions in our version of the game, but there are a lot of different tweaks here too. So the first couple there, controlling oil territories. We talked in the prior video about how some of these have oil derricks on them, and you've seen this, and there's all sorts of house rules that use oil derricks, and obviously you're going to find those in the Middle East. You're going to find those in the Money Islands primarily, a ton of them over there, and some are spread throughout. You've got one here in Venezuela, which is a strict neutral, so not likely to come up very often. You've got one here in Romania even. So there are options, and there are 2 levels there. You get 4 of them, you get 1 victory point. You get 4 more, you get another. Okay, that's cool. Atlantic Wall, 5 land units in each of these Western European border territories. That's certainly doable. South Africa, resources. We mentioned this in the map video that there are a handful of territories all in Asia that have this little symbol on them that indicates that they have what's called resources. So here in Tibet, for example, a strict neutral, has them up in the Urals. You see that symbol as well. There aren't many of them on the board. You get another one here in Siberia that has that little symbol on it. So again, adding value to those territories for getting those points that the Axis need that wouldn't otherwise be there. Tibet being a strict neutral, Venezuela being a strict neutral. These are reasons why you might want to actually attack neutrals in a game, which the out-of-box version doesn't really give you those reasons. South Asia. So this combination of territories down there is usually something that Japan's going to gobble up, but this gives them another reason too. Japanese income tracker, all of China. China's an out-of-box one that shows up in ours as well. But the African Horn, the Mediterranean, different versions on controlling those areas as well. And you see a few others there that I don't have to read to all of it, including strict neutrals itself. That just being a reason to straight up attack them so that you can get those. But each one of those win conditions, each one of those objectives is itself another victory point. And as mentioned, you need 12 for the Axis to win. So within that 8-turn time limit, if the Axis can get up to 12 of those victory points, they win the game. It's done. How do the Allies win? Well, by keeping that from happening. The Allies can win in a couple of different ways. They can prevent the Axis from getting those points after 8 turns, or they can take one of the 2 capitals. Obviously, each side can win that way too, the traditional way of taking all the capitals on the other side. But because we know that that's hard to do, certainly within 8 turns, we have all these other options too. So, frankly, you already know that in the Omega rule set, we have all sorts of different victory token conditions similar to these, analogous to these, in order to get tokens instead of points, and you add those up to win the game. So this is a similar approach, just a lot more subdivided, a lot more nuanced, and opening up a lot of different strategic options and reasons to pursue them in the game. So that's something that really intrigues me, that I'm looking forward to playing with more. The second bucket of rules that make BBR different is the game board and political situation. So what's different about the game board in ways that affect the rules? We talked about how the game board is designed differently. Here's what makes it significant. We'll just go through a couple small things. Capital ships can't pass through the Turkish Strait no matter what. That's fine. That's an interesting little tweak. This pass up here, we talked about how it limits the types of units that can go through here. But one interesting fact that you don't know from the board, only from reading the rules, is that pieces from opposing nations can actually occupy this space at the same time. So you can have a Russian and a Japanese unit in that same space without fighting. That's the only space on the board where that can happen, because there is no combat in that pass. So how that's going to work in practice, I don't know, but that's at least one of the new little tweaks. We also talked about the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which shows up on the map, but how does that impact gameplay? Well, here's the answer. Only Russia can use it, which is a little disappointing, because historically there were Americans that rode that railroad during World War II. But regardless, in the game, only the Russians can use it. And only one land unit can use it at a time. So you can have an infantry in Amur, for example, as you coincidentally do at the beginning of the game, and it can ride that railroad all the way to Moscow if it wants to, or stop at any point along the way. But only one. So you're not bringing that whole stack from, Eastern Russia all the way back to Moscow at the beginning of the game. That would be broken. But you can kind of shoot one back each turn as they continue that march back home, if that's where you want to send them. You can't do that, though, if the line is broken. There's only one hub for the railroad. It's in Moscow. And if at any point that line is broken, then anything further east along the railroad is inoperable. So what do I mean by that? Let's say there's a Japanese unit in Kansu, for example. I don't know how that would happen, but it happens. And that Japanese unit comes up and takes Tunguska. Well, that means the railroad only works now from Novosibirsk to Moscow. Everything else east along this railroad is inoperable. So if, in fact, Tunguska is occupied by the Japanese, then you can no longer send a land unit from Amur to Yenevsky. It doesn't operate. It only operates west of the most contiguous line. There are a few tweaks to the national objectives that each player has. I won't go through each and every one of them. One of them is that Germany has 5 submarines anywhere on the map. That compares to one of the objectives that we have in the Omega rules, where they have to have a certain number of subs in the Atlantic or Mediterranean Ocean. We restrict where those can be. This just says anywhere on the map to make it easier. There are some others that I won't spoil because they impact other political situation rules that I'll talk about in a minute. The Russians have an interesting tweak in their political situation. So, for instance, if any of these Turkish territories, which, as we've mentioned before, are now broken down into 3, But if any of them are attacked, the Soviet Union is immediately in the war against the European Axis. I guess the rationale being, that's the soft underbelly here of Russia, and that would make them sensitive to an Axis invasion. Not too far off from current situation here, a little north on the map, but we see the sensitivity of this region already, so it's not hard to believe that an attack on Turkey would provoke the similar reaction from the Soviets. There's also some additional circumstances in which the Russians can declare war early. So the Turkish thing triggers immediately. If any of the following happen, then the Soviets may declare war on the European Axis on turn 3 instead of on turn 4. One of those is if Japan has declared war on the Russians. Now that's interesting because usually the Japanese and European theaters are completely separate from each other, don't affect Russia's situation on the other side of the board. Here, if Japan attacks Russia on turn 1, that doesn't give them the ability to attack Germany right away, but it does let them attack Germany a 1 turn earlier, which now requires the Axis players to talk to each other a little bit more about these things. Second is if the Axis have taken control of Castilla, which is the territory in Spain where Madrid is located. Now that's interesting too. We talked a little bit in the last video about how cool it is that Spain is pro-Axis. We're going to find out that's, a lot more complicated than it looks, and this is just the first reason why. Because if they take this particular territory, not the other two, just this one, if it turns Axis, then that means the Russians can declare war a turn earlier. Why that is, that's a little harder to follow. Have to get a little bit deeper into World War II history, I suppose. But then the last one, this also makes a lot of sense, frankly, is if there are 10 or more Axis units on the Eastern Front, meaning Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. If there are a total of 10 or more Axis units in between these 3 territories, then the Russians can declare war on turn 3 instead of turn 4. Again, they see what the writing on the wall that gives them the political cover they need. Frankly, I think that's a pretty good rule, pretty logical rule. I don't know about how it works in gameplay, but it's a pretty logical one. Japan, they have some that are tweaked, including one that's affected by Thailand. You already know that they get a bonus if they haven't attacked French Indochina. That bonus now is also contingent on them not occupying the pro-Axis territory of Thailand as well. The U.S. has an interesting one. So that normally they can't move C units past 102 here. What's 102 on the other board? At least I think that's the number. It's A22 here. They can't move out this far until they're at war. Well, if, though, the European Axis have declared war on the Russians now, or if the U.S. is not already at war by turn 3, then the European naval restrictions are lifted. So in other words, there are ways that the U.S. can get past here and move farther to Europe before they're even at war on turn 4. There's also, I won't get too far into it, but there's also an interesting rule about their extra IPCs when they join the war. The earlier they join the war, the less bonus money they get when they go to war. So, for example, if the U.S. gets pulled into the war on turn 1, they get 0 extra IPCs. If it's turn 2, then they get 15. Turn 3, they get 30. So a real incentive now for the U.S. to wait, because now it's an economic bonus. It's really kind of an interesting mix here. If the with the UK here, if Japan attacks them, it declares war on them in the Pacific, they get a bonus infantry here in India representing volunteer Indian fighters. If the UK declares war, however, that doesn't happen. That's interesting. Perhaps the most significant change to the political rules, although, frankly, one that much more accurately represents real life, real history, is that of the Italians, though, and that is the fall of Rome. Once the Allies take Rome, if in fact they do, Italy becomes an allied power. It allies with the Allies instead of the Axis. Again, that reflects history. But how it works out in the game is territories that were Axis control that have both German and Italian pieces in them, they become all German, or Japanese if they happen to control them. And some of those things flip control. But now there are bonuses. There are actually national objective bonuses that Italy can get for taking German territories, and vice versa. Germany can get bonuses for taking original Italian territories, and they become enemies. And I'm going to get into all the details, but that's just a lot of fun. Not a ton of fun for the Axis player, frankly, because once Rome falls, it's never really been anything but a matter of time at that point. But hey, maybe this flips it. Maybe this gives ways for the Germans to cope with that development. The Commonwealth, as we mentioned before, is the combination of what's normally Anzac in the game and Canada. They actually have two capitals, Ottawa and Sydney, and under this rule set, if either of those capitals falls, then the entire country loses their income, just like would normally happen if another player lost their one capital. So that makes them a little bit more vulnerable, but really, how often does Ottawa fall? So that's the differences in the national objectives. How does the rest of the political situation work? Well, it gets a little bit more complicated. One thing about strict neutrals. So we mentioned that there are reasons in this game you'd maybe want to attack those strict neutrals. There's a downside. You know that in the regular game and in Omega rules, if you just straight up attack a strict neutral, that flips all the other strict neutrals to being pro the other side. Pro allies if the Axis attack them, and vice versa. In this version of the game, they don't just become pro, they become controlled by the other side. So, for example, if Japan just starts attacking strict neutrals by taking Tibet, for example, all of the other strict neutrals flip to the other side. Afghanistan then would become a UK territory with UK pieces in it. It wouldn't just become a pro-allied territory. It would actually become an allied territory. So that increases the stakes of a decision like that significantly. In China, in addition to their normal setup of units, they get a cavalry. In fact, they get 3 cavalries, and they can set them up at the beginning of the game in any territory they'd like. So they get 3 of these to spread around at their discretion. We can talk about what those pieces do in a little bit, but that adds one more piece to the setup, a little bit of randomness there, where China has a choice to be able to decide where to put those. Sticking with the smaller territories, there are special rules for Argentina and Chile. So we already noted on the board that Argentina, anyway, is listed as a pro-Axis country. Not only that, but if Germany collects at least 53 IPCs, not including national objective bonuses, if they are collecting at least 53 on the IPC tracker, then Argentina immediately flips to German control. Why that is, again, historically speaking, I don't know. But it flips and becomes a German territory. You'll see it actually comes with a transport there as well. And if Germans get at least 56 on the IPC tracker, then Chile becomes a pro-Axis territory, not flipping to German control, but flipping to a pro-Axis state from the strict neutral condition that it begins at. But wait, there's more. There's also special rules for Spain and Portugal. Okay, well, what's up with that? Well, I mentioned that this whole Spanish situation gets more complicated than it just being pro-Axis. And that's because not only are there special rules around Spain, but around Portugal as well. And this is inspired by history and Portugal's bilateral treaty with the UK, apparently. So here's how that goes down. If any Spanish marked territory is attacked by the Allies, which remember it could be because it's pro-Axis, if the Allies choose to attack anything in Spain, then all the remaining Spanish marked territories immediately become German. It's as if you got a mini version of the strict neutral rule there. You attack one Spanish, the others immediately flip, and they become stocked with German units. And at that time, Argentina also gets triggered. So let's say the UK player comes down here and invades Galicia, thinking, okay, I'm going to get a foothold on the Iberian Peninsula. Well, that has ramifications. Aragon and Castilla then immediately flip to German control, and Argentina does as well. If any pro-Axis Spanish territory is taken by the Axis player, though, then all Portuguese marked territories immediately become UK territories, flipping their standing armies to UK control. Now, Portugal is a strict neutral at the beginning, and if it's directly attacked, well, then that triggers neutral rules, but not. No, I'll take that back. Not all the strict neutral rules. So let's back that up. If the Axis come in and say, oh, okay, hey, cool, these are pro-Axis territories, I'm just going to take them all, well, then that's fine, they can do that. But then Portugal, which is right next door, it flips. And you might be thinking, okay, well, it's just Portugal. Well, they've got 4 infantry there, which is not nothing. They have a cruiser, which they begin with at the game, and there's this new little island territory that's not in the original map, the Azores, which has its own infantry and its own little place where you can land. And, wait, there's more. Down here in Africa, these 2 territories, Angola and Mozambique, which in the regular map are just notated as strict neutral territories, they are also flipped and become UK territories, each with 2 infantry. That adds up and certainly bolsters the UK presence down in South Africa. So we have like a little mini neutral balance here. It won't flip the rest of the board, but it affects more than just the territories involved. There's a big strategic shift that happens when either the Spanish or the Portuguese territories flip control. So enter at your own risk. France has its own interesting rules. So we know that, you're always going to take France as a German player. And we noted before that what was normally called Southern France is called France, City of Vichy here in this version of the game. That has not only a historical explanation, it has a particular rule set in this game. So if Germany, and only Germany, this doesn't count if Italy takes it, if Germany takes City of Vichy, then they have an option. They can just take the territory and collect the IPCs as normal, or they can trigger what is called an armistice with the French. What happens when you declare an armistice with the French? Boom. That's what happens. So the German player, if they declare an armistice, has the option of retreating from Vichy and leaving one French unit that will pop up and replace them with a blue control marker underneath it. Every other French unit on the board at that point also gets these little frozen markers underneath them. If it's the one that's stationed in London or it's in a territory with other Allied units, this doesn't happen. But any French marked territory that's empty, or any territory with only French units in them, automatically become Vichy French. And those, of course, were the French that were nominally allied with the Germans. So they are then considered unfriendly neutrals. at that point. Not strict neutrals, but they're treated as if they were neutrals. They're frozen with these little chips, meaning that the French player no longer controls them. The French player can no longer move them around and fight with them in the Allies' favor. They are considered neutral, can be attacked at any time either by Allied or Axis powers. And they're considered unfriendly to either side. So you can take them without, triggering a reaction from other neutrals and occupy and control those territories. And that happens as long as the armistice is in place. How does the armistice get broken? The armistice gets broken by any nation attacking and retaking the Vichy territory, southern France. Interestingly, that can be done by the Axis as well. If either the Italians or the Germans say, you know what, screw it, we need to occupy southern France, they can go back and do that, but then that unfreezes all the other French units. The French player now controls them, can do whatever he wants with them. But that's interesting, and again, a little bit of flavor that reflects another aspect of history that's not normally seen in the game. Russia has an interesting little twist on its rules. Now, Lend-Lease is a version of the rules that have existed since the beginning in Out-of-Box and in Omega Rules. This one, though, makes it a little beefier and a little more in favor of the Soviets. So you have your traditional Lend-Lease zones here in the Far East. You've got it up here in Archangel as well. Normally, these are just economic rules, right? As long as those sea zones are open, the Russians get an economic bonus. Here, however, it is a military bonus. As long as those spots are open and the Russians are at war, you roll a die, and depending on what number is rolled, you get a bonus. So in Europe at Archangel, that is always going to be some military unit, and it can be even a tank, or something equally significant. In the Pacific, it's a little less beefy, but it could be military units, or it could be IPCs. As much as 7 IPCs coming through that Lend-Lease zone, making those that much more strategically important. Russia also gets what's called a mobile production rule, which again is supposed to reflect reality, in that the Soviets had mobile production factories. So minor industrial complexes, not major ones, can be moved to a adjacent, originally controlled Soviet territory, the value of 1 or greater, and only 1 space per turn. There are other rules, but just the fact that industrial complexes can move at all makes them a lot harder for the Axis to kill them. So you'll start with one here in Stalingrad. You'll start with one in Ukraine. There is one in Leningrad. So there are all sorts of ways that the Russian player can keep his factories open and conversely deny the Axis from controlling them. That makes a big difference in strategy. We talked about the Turkish rule already and how that trips the Russians straight into the war. Japanese and their political situation, just a small tweak on the kamikaze rule. It's not something that can be used immediately in the game. There's a certain threshold that needs to be reached before the kamikaze rule becomes available, and that's one of 2 things has to happen. At least one of the following islands are either captured or recaptured by the Allies. That would be the Philippines, Marianas, Okinawa, Guam, and Iwo Jima, meaning they have to have been taken, in the Philippines case, by the Japanese and then lost again, or the Allies come and take one of those other islands, or Japan achieved at least 37 IPCs on the tracker and has fallen down to less than that. At that point, the kamikaze rule becomes effective too. I don't know of a situation in which the Japanese are going to use a kamikaze where something like that hasn't already happened, but be that as it may. All right, now we're going to get into how the game is played and what makes that different in this version of the game. And the first difference is the very first phase of a turn, which is going to be research and development. Now, this R&D chart will look not at all familiar to anyone who hasn't played this version of the game, because it's a new approach. Again, though, after having played it once, I gotta admit, I really kind of like it. So R&D, the choices that you get are very similar to a lot of the other versions of the game. I haven't gone and compared them in minute detail, but jet fighters, super subs, heavy bombers, those are all familiar upgrades. With super carriers, improved shipyards, self-propelled artillery, better transports, heavy tanks. Most of those are in the out-of-box game. Several of them are in the Omega rules as well. But those are the choices that you get to choose from. But here's how the approach differs significantly from other versions of the game. So before the game begins here, each player, each of the major powers, not just Germany, Russia, Japan, US, and UK, not even the minors, and then of course the others as well. But they get to pick a tech. They go around, they select any one of the technology, and there you'll have roundels representing those technologies. Here we're just going to use a blank one, but you take them and you place them upside down, and you put them next to your marker for free. So let's say that I'm playing the US, and I've chosen heavy tanks. That's what this is going to represent. I put it down here in P1. It starts the game here in P1, which represents phase 1. Now, during turn 1, at the top of every round is the R&D phase, and you can choose whether or not to buy into this phase. You don't have to, but you've chosen the technology at the outset of the game that you want to research towards. That makes, of course, a good deal of sense compared to the out-of-box version, where you're just rolling a die and getting a random technology. There are explanations for why each version makes sense, but this one adds a little bit more intentionality to it. You have a particular technology that you are working towards. You put it there. And progressing to phase 2 is a simple matter of just paying 4 IPCs. You automatically move it up to P2 at that point. Now, progressing to phase 3 costs 4 more IPCs. That's the next turn. Now here you've reached turn 4, and you're moving on turn 3, and it's time to try and get it into the active phase. This is where you're going to roll a die, a 6-sided die. If you roll a 6, your technology automatically skips over to this active spot right here. If you also have to pay 6 IPCs in order to get it there. So at that point, you've paid a minimum of 14 IPCs to get that active technology, but it's spread over 3 turns at least. Now, if you don't roll a 6, you move it to this H, which stands for hold. It means you're ultimately going to get a chance to activate it, but it's going to take you another turn. And if you're in that hold spot, you pay money for the number that was rolled. So if you manage to roll a 1, you're only paying 1 IPC. If you roll a 5, you're paying 5 IPCs just for the privilege of getting it into this hold spot. So that's where it starts to get a little expensive. But once it's in that hold, it remains there until you roll a 5 or a 6. And you get those dice by paying for them. You can pay 1 IPC each, and you can buy up to 10 dice. And this gets back into, original 1980s version of Axis, where you're just buying a bunch of dice and chucking them and trying to get technology. At least that's, what happened in a lot of our games back in the 80s. If you roll a 5 or a 6 in this endeavor, just one of them, you get to move it up to the active spot. If not, better luck next time. So you could get a technology in place, as early as turn 3 or 4 here in the active spot, or you could get stuck in this hold pattern indefinitely. Interestingly, though, once you get it into this active spot, then you still don't need to flip it over. You don't even flip over the technology and reveal to others what you have gotten until you use it. So if you've got heavy tanks, for example, you don't have to show that unless you're going to start rolling for heavy tanks. That's the point where you flip the tech over, you surprise your opponent, say, hey, guess what? And so that adds an interesting little twist, too, in terms of intelligence just within your tactical choices. Now, as mentioned, that is the very first step in the order of play. Germany goes first as normal, but then you'll notice Russia. Hey, wait a minute, where's the Soviet Union? That's all the way down at the bottom. This turn order is pretty comparable to a normal round of G40, except that the Soviets get moved from second place all the way to the end of the turn sequence. I've only played the game once. I haven't really reflected on how that affects play, but that certainly gives the Axis, the little German-Japan combo especially, a little extra chance to push the Soviets around before they get a chance to fire back. Changes some of your strategies for sure. Another little interesting tidbit that I noticed is that when you're in that build phase and the repair and everything else phase where you're fixing damage on your facilities, for example, you also have the option to pay to add damage to your facilities. We have we've played with some rules in the Omega set. The idea of being able to sabotage your own facilities, which of course you might do if you think they're about to get taken over. Can't do it for free, it costs you money, but you can pay money to add damage to your own facilities, or you can scrap them entirely. That's an interesting little tidbit, and I think probably a nice option to have. A rule that I have a harder time wrapping my mind around, though, is this idea of AAA gun flyovers. Now, y'all know that when you attack a territory with a AAA gun in it, be it a unit or one that's built into a facility that you're strap bombing, that gun gets a chance to roll and try and shoot you down before the combat begins. Here, though, this says that the same thing happens every time you fly over a territory with a AAA gun in it to get to a combat. In other words, we know that air units have 4 or 6 movement points. They are often flying over hostile territories to get to the territory that they want to attack. And it's only the one AA gun in the target territory that ever gets to roll. This changes that calculus dramatically by giving the AAA guns in every territory you fly over a chance to shoot you down. That makes aircraft a whole lot more vulnerable than they used to be. And one situation where you're going to particularly feel this is the good old Toranto Raid. So, as happens in many, many games, the UK may very well opt to bring their planes from London down over Europe and into the Aegean Sea here, which is called A34 on this map. It's got another number on the regular board. And come down, combine with the air units that are here in A36 to wipe out the Italian Navy before the Italians get a chance to attack. That happens so frequently that it is almost a standard in many games. However, under the BBR rules, little Mr. Happy UK planes have to fly over Western Germany, Northern Italy, and then into A34, and they get shot at every step of the way. And you're saying, wait a minute, every step of the way, what are you talking about? Well, that's Western Germany, AAA guns get a shot. Northern Italy, AAA guns get a shot. They get into A34, they get into this battle boat, but hey, wait a minute. And this is something we'll talk about later, but in this version of the rules, battleships have AAA guns. So they get a shot. All of which combines to make the Toranto Raid a whole heck of a lot less appealing. One wonders if that alone is the impetus for this rule change. It's certainly going to have an effect in a lot of other situations as well. But that whole power projection with air units all of a sudden got nerfed. But wait, there's more. That's not the only time-honored move that gets upended by the BBR rule set. The other is the famous Naval Blocker. We're all very familiar with this move that happens in virtually every game, where one large navy can block the other from attacking just by throwing out a blocker, because you normally can't move through a sea zone with even one blocker in it without destroying it. And of course that stops the entire navy. So that means that a huge fleet in Hawaii, for example, can't get to Japan through this one blocker, always a destroyer, that gets dropped down there to block the way. So they have to go 1, 2, stop here, fight that battle. The Japanese homeland is safe. Well, not anymore. Naval blockers now can only block up to 3 naval units. So in this little microcosm of an example, we've got 5 American ships and 1 Japanese blocker. So this Japanese destroyer doesn't block the entire navy anymore. He only blocks 3 ships. So the attacker decides which 3 of the ships get blocked. And it can be more than 3 that stop and fight the destroyer. But essentially what you're doing is you're splitting up your navy into 2 groups here. The group that's fighting the blocker and the group that's trying to punch through. Let's say in this instance, it's going to be like this. And the ones that are trying to get through, they don't participate in this battle. The 3 that are blocked, they do. But they also have to stop. They get blocked like they normally would by this combat. So they engage in it. Let's say they knock out the destroyer. Now the other 2 can proceed through, take their 3rd movement point, and go here, go here, go here. And if they go here, they participate in a combat here. Now, a second combat. And they can join up with others that came from a different direction, planes, whatever else, units that don't get blocked, and then they perform that combat. But there are 2 combats that happens in that movement. And the ones that are blocked, the ones that stayed here and fought, they're stuck. They stay where they are. And if we had thrown a 4th ship in there, optionally, for example, then that would stay there too, and the battleship would get through. Point being, though, you can no longer rely on the handy-dandy blocker. It's not useless. It blocks 3 ships, and those 3 ships can't go through, but the rest of them can. So while it certainly slows down a large naval advance, it can't stop it anymore. What's the outcome of that going to be? Well, again, it reduces power projection. If you can no longer safely hold off, then you are not going to spread yourself thin. You're not going to leave the Japanese Isles, in this instance, under-defended, just throwing out a blocker. You're going to leave more naval defenders there. You're going to throw more blockers out. But you can't be as cavalier with your home territory, spreading your ships out everywhere, just in reliance on throwing 1 destroyer blocker out every turn. Same goes for the U.S., of course. You often see a U.S. blocker there at Midway to protect Hawaii while the rest of the American fleet goes and does what it does. Hawaii now is vulnerable too, but I think this is going to hit Japan a bit harder, right? Because they rely on that projection earlier in the game and a lot more different targets, more so than the Americans do. The Americans can afford to pile up in Hawaii, take their time, and move in force when they do move out, whereas the Japanese have to be quicker and dirtier about it. So this is going to hurt the Japanese quite a bit. The next major change to how combat operates is called target select. And in a nutshell, what this does is allow certain attacking units to decide what target they're going to hit. Normally, of course, it's the defender who assigns hits. Here, in certain limited circumstances, that flips to the attacker. Now, only 2 units have target selectability. That would be the submarine and the attack bomber. No other units have this ability available. With submarines, they get to target select in the Navy that they're attacking, and like normal, submarines rule first with their surprise shot. But usually the defender gets to assign that surprise shot hit here. That flips that to the attacking submarine. Now, defending submarines also get what's called strike, which is a flip side ability. So defending subs also get the same as target select, essentially, except that it is on the defense side. They're still rolling a 1, but subs get to choose. Now, this target select ability is mooted. It's neutered by a defending submarine. So just like a defending submarine would take away the surprise shot ability, it takes away target selecting ability in this rule set as well. So that's the situation with submarines. TAC bombers are analogous to that. They have the option of attacking with the target select ability. In other words, choosing their target. This has a nerf as well if there is a defending AAA gun, which of course you're not going to get in. Well, you would get in a naval battle with a battleship, of course, since, why not? They have those now. But if there's a defending AAA gun, then that doesn't happen. Otherwise, attack bombers get to choose their target. Now, if attack bomber is using its target select ability, it does not get the combined arms. So in other words, if it's attacking with a plane in the attacking group, but it's using the target select ability, then it only attacks at a 3 and not a 4. Otherwise, though, if it were attacking with the plane, it would still get that combined arms boost. Another limitation to target select: transports, infantry, submarines, and air units are all invalid targets for a target select. You have to target something else: a capital ship, a warship, a tank, something along those lines. So that adds a little bit of advantage to the attacker. Certainly boosts the value of those pieces, gives you a reason to pay 1 extra to build a TAC bomber instead of a fighter, I suppose, in some limited circumstances. Still, though, I'm having played the game like this once, I'm a little leery of it just because it upsets that balance on assigning hits. And so that's a little tricky. Take me a few more games, I guess, to decide how I really feel about it. But it really is a big shift to give the attacker that much control over what it's destroying. All right, the final bucket of rules is unit profiles. Let's begin with the facilities. Some interesting new additions here. Now, like in the out-of-box game, and unlike our Omega rules, there are only 2 sets of production facilities that you can use, and that is the major industrial complex and the minor industrial complex. Ours adds 3 and 4, but as in most versions of the game, you've got minors and you've got majors. Majors can produce up to 10 units, minors can produce 3. What's interesting about both, though, under the BBR rules is a new rule called integrated railways. What does that mean? So it means that every time you have one of these factories, whether it's major or minor, they automatically come with these unseen railway connections that emanate out from the factories in every direction for 3 spaces. So you get those movements during non-com, and not during combat, during non-com movement only. Means you can, starting from a territory that has a factory in it, you can move units, land units with enough movement points, that have some movement points anyway, up to 3 spaces of movement from the factory. So if you have land units here in Calcutta, for example, in India, at the end of combat, and you want to move them in the non-combat phase, you can do that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, automatically. It doesn't matter if they're infantry that can only move 1, tanks that can only move 2. You can rail them up to 3 spaces. And then the same goes for a minor factory. That obviously moves things to the front a lot quicker. So you've got UK units here that are just shooting into China. And if you, in fact, control it, it has to be Allied territory. It has to be territory that was controlled at the start of the turn. So, you can't say, defeat German or Japanese troops here in Burma and then rail people through it. It has to be all the way through territories that were controlled at the beginning of the turn. So that's somewhat of a limitation, but in a lot of cases, it's not going to be much of a limitation. Take, for example, Stalingrad. And remember, factory units are mobile in Russia. So let's say you've already moved this factory over here. Well, now it's got 3 spaces of integrated railways. You built something here, and you can non-com all the way up to the front if you want to. Now, that's consistent with the design philosophy of the BBR rules, which, remember, is only limited to 8 turns. You've only got 8 turns to play this game out. And in a normal Axis and Allies game, it may take you 8 turns to get your pieces where you want them to go. For example, up here in Siberia, right? So these railways, be they the Siberian railway or these, phantom integrated railways coming out from these factories, serve the purpose of accelerating the game so that you can get a lot of stuff done in 8 turns. So from that perspective, it's a smart design element. From an overall gameplay perspective, if time were not a factor, boy, that really upsets some of the chess piece nature of Axis and Allies, and just opens up all sorts of movement possibilities that weren't there before, and power projection opportunities, and really makes things difficult to defend against. Not necessarily a bad thing, just a whole different game state than your normal Axis and Allies game. So that's just something that's going to have to be time tested with experience. Few other things, facilities, for example, like an air base, are inoperable if they have any damage points at all. In our version, they have to have 50% damage before they become inoperable. Here, it's all or nothing. If they're damaged at all, they can't be used. I mentioned the flyover thing already. That really concerns me a bit. But it's a big, significant change for AAA guns. The other interesting factor about AAA guns is that they can be captured. So just like normal, they can be taken as hits in a battle where they are one of many units in the combat. But if you've got a AAA gun just sitting by itself in an otherwise unoccupied territory, and enemy units roll through it, they don't destroy that AAA gun. They actually take control of it and swap it with one of their own color. And that is not a circumstance that happens terribly often, so that actually kind of makes some sense to me. Why would you destroy it when there's nothing for it to shoot at, no battle for it to participate in? But nevertheless, it's an interesting little quirk. We mentioned earlier that there's an additional piece in this version of the game, and that's the Cavalry. What makes Cavalry different is they are like a mech infantry in that they can move 2, which makes sense. They're more mobile, but also makes sense that they're less tough than a mech infantry because it's just a dude on a horse. So it has, instead of an attack of 1 and a defense of 2, like most infantry does, it actually has a attack of 2 and a defense of 1. They also have the ability to blitz on their own, unlike a mech infantry would. So that's something. Little tweak, remix of the other land units that we have, the other infantry units that we have kind of twists and turns their abilities and offers them in a different combination in the form of this cavalry unit. The next unit to receive a tweak is the mighty strategic bomber. Now, one optional rule that is common in a lot of house rule sets, including the Omega rules, that doesn't show up in BBR is the idea of a paratrooper, at least not strictly speaking. So in our rule set, for example, you can basically launch up to 2 infantry from an airbase, and they just kind of spawn in the territory where they land, as if they had been paradropped there. Here in this version of the game, you have something similar, and in fact a lot more powerful, but you need to dedicate a bomber unit to do it. So at the beginning of your combat phase, you can designate one of your existing strategic bombers to be an air transport unit instead. So for the remainder of that turn, it flies like normal. It has a 6-space movement, just like a normal bomber would, but instead of attacking, it can only transport infantry units at that point. But it can transport up to 6 of them. So unlike our rules, our paradropper rules, which are limited to 2, that's 6 infantry being dropped from just this one bomber. Of course, it's subject to AAA rules, which means it can be shot down, and if it's shot down, all those guys go with them. It also is subject to the familiar limitation that it has to be dropped into an active war zone where there are already land units coming in, and you can't have more paratroopers than you do attacking land units. So if there are only 2 infantry coming into a battle, you can't airdrop 6 of them. You can only drop 2 more. But in a major combat situation, the option of adding 6 more dudes to the mix makes a pretty huge difference. And that's an interesting little addition there. We've already mentioned in terms of naval units that battleships now have AAA guns in them. Now here's back to the idea of the rules being kind of indeterminate. You'll see in this revision, now this revision here that I have is kind of errata sheet to the 6.8 manual. It's still labeled 6.8, which is the same as this book that I'm working from. And it's got some of the same additions to the rules that I mentioned before, except that it has this one that doesn't show up in the 6.8 book, which is that cruisers also have a AAA gun. I mean, there's AAAs in everything at this point, if even cruisers are carrying them. So is that an actual rule in this set? I'm not sure. But according to that errata sheet, it is. And now even cruisers have AAAs. Other than that, though, yeah, there's a couple of combined arms situations that can happen that aren't in the regular version of the game. For example, here it says transports can pair up with each other. If you obviously they usually have a defense of 0, but if you put 2 of them next to each other, then one of them can defend at a 1 instead of a 0. Awfully minor tweak there to be worried about. So I don't know that's going to make a huge difference, especially because it also says even those 2 transports banded up with each other don't have the ability to block naval units by themselves. So what the point of that is, it's hard to say. But those are the tweaks to the unit profiles. There is one more combined arms rule which I failed to mention, and that is this here, where a battleship and a cruiser can combine up so that the cruiser defends on a 4 now instead of a 3. Just one more cruiser tweak. Again, neither of those rules are really going to come into effect that often because people don't really buy cruisers all that often. The last set of rules. Now we've gone through all of the new rules to BBR. That's it. You might be laughing like that's it. That was a ton. You're right, but it's digestible if you take it in chunks. And a lot of them have a logic to them, which makes it easier to remember. But the book itself comes with a set of optional rules, which I did get a chance to play with. They are interesting. And these are one-time kind of freakish occurrences that you can play with that add a little bit more unpredictability to the game. And these are in the book here. Blitzkrieg, just in short, once per game, the Germans can take a group of land units through an occupied territory, ignoring the enemy units that are there, to attack a territory on the other side of it. Just blitzkrieg right through a territory like ghosts in order to get to the other side. Similarly, the Japanese player can do a bonsai charge once per game, which boosts all the attack value of their infantry from 1 to 2 for just the first round of combat. So, use wisely. And then there's the Allied Coalition rule, where once per game, the U.S. and UK can make a joint attack in which the U.S. player takes control of the UK pieces for one combat. They all attack together on the U.S. turn, and then after that, they go back to being UK pieces. This, of course, is meant to reflect D-Day, but you can apply it in any situation you like. Now, again, we have another errata sheet, which has still further BBR optional rules, and it says here that this is recommended to be played with the other optional rules. There's a Pripyat Marshes rule, which you'll recall the Pripyat Marshes being this territory over here. On the normal board, that is impassable. It doesn't say that on this board. But under this approach, that becomes just like an island territory where you can't rail through it. You have to stop when you enter or exit it, but otherwise it can be traversed. It's just a little bit slower to get through. And then there's this optional fortifications rule where if the Germans occupy all these border territories on the Western Front, they're given these fortification tokens, which are essentially the pillboxes that we would use, or coastal guns, or whatever you call them in your particular house rule set. But that too just adds a little bit of additional nuance to the game. But wait, there's more. So, not to be outdone, there are still more optional rules that are available out there, and that's in the form of this deck of cards here that Cyberblood sells, called the Spoils of War Expansion deck. And this acts like, there was a game back in the 80s and 90s called Supremacy, and it had a World War, area control game just like this one. It had an expansion called the Fortuna deck, which was basically you flip over one card per turn in a random global event, like a weather event or something happens, and it affects the whole game. Well, this is something similar. Without going through all the rules, you take so many of them, only so many come into play per turn, per game even, and you get to play them at certain points of time, but you put them into play and they change the rules for everybody. So this one, 12 units now instead of 10 from major industrial comebacks. Oh, for this turn, battleships now defend at 2. Both Axis allies must return 10 IBCs to the thing. Just, and these get, shuffled up, and only a few of them pop up per game. Actually, I think there might be one per turn, something like that, that apply to everybody. Any event, they are random events that can change the basic rules of the game if you like to add that much more unpredictability to it. One thing I do appreciate is that the BBR community is really big into cards. And these are cards that basically take all those rules we just talked about and break them down into individual cards. So you have a handy dandy little
cheat sheet here for the UK on its political situation reminds you of all those little nuances that we talked about. Here we have a different card for each of their national objectives. So you can flip that over to remind yourself of that. Here's some more on the political situation. National objectives. Now you got U.S. reminders. You've got Chinese reminders. So this is an allied deck of cards, oversized cards at that too, pretty good size. Got another one here for the Axis players. So each player has their set of handy-dandy little reminder rule cards that make it easier to consult the rules without having to necessarily flip open the book. And with that, my friends, I'm going to call an end to this video. I think that we have covered the BBR rule set in a sufficiently exhaustive level of detail that if you can understand and grok the particular rules that I've talked about in this video, then you can confidently come to the table of a BBR game and hold your own, understanding how the game is played. Strategy, how you turn all these rules to your advantage and use them in ways that you might not normally in an Axis and Allies game, well, that's up to you, my friends. Till next time, signing off.